There once existed civilizations whose brilliance seemed destined to outlast time itself, yet concealed within the forgotten corridors of history, a people arose who constructed colossal urban centers, their pyramids piercing the emerald ceiling of the jungle, and who possessed an understanding of the heavens that far surpassed the capabilities of their contemporaries. These were the Maya, sovereigns of the celestial sphere, master builders who shaped stone and spirit alike, and guardians of a cultural inheritance that the modern age continues to strive to comprehend. Then, around the 9th century, an astonishing transformation occurred. Their teeming metropolises fell abruptly silent. Populations evaporated, magnificent plazas emptied, and the towering stone edifices were gradually consumed by the relentless embrace of the forest. A society that had appeared indestructible seemed to vanish in little more than a single protracted sigh of historical time. This enigma has tormented scholars and dreamers for generations. What truly became of the Maya? Was it nature itself that turned against them, unleashing catastrophic, unrelenting droughts? Was it the corrosive force of internal warfare and societal fracture that tore their world apart? Or was it the crushing weight of their own magnificent success? A system that grew so grand it ultimately buckled under the burden of its own achievements. Countless hypotheses have been proposed. Yet each time we believe we have grasped the solution, the Maya elude us once more, leaving in their wake an even greater constellation of unsolved mysteries. In this exploration, we will journey back into the verdant, tangled jungles of Central America, to the very soil where the Maya once erected their skyscraping pyramids, vibrant ceremonial plazas, and observatories meticulously calibrated to the movements of the stars. We will trace their origins, examine the ascent of their greatness, and seek to understand why, in the end, they faded so quietly from the stage of history, abandoning their magnificent cities to the encroaching darkness of the forest. This is not merely a chronicle of antiquity. It is a poignant reminder of the profound fragility that underlies every human civilization, no matter how seemingly eternal. When we envision the Maya, our minds conjure images of their awe-inspiring pyramids emerging defiantly from the jungle. But before they could raise these monuments to the sky, the Maya had to conquer a far more fundamental challenge: agriculture. Farming was the bedrock upon which their entire society rested, the vital thread that bound the people to the earth, and, in their cosmology, to the universe itself. The Maya inhabited a land that was expansive yet unforgiving. Unlike the fertile river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, they had no great, life-giving rivers to deposit rich silt upon their fields. Instead, they confronted arid limestone plateaus, steamy, impenetrable rainforests, and prolonged dry seasons that split the earth open with thirst. And yet, amidst these formidable obstacles, they demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity, transforming nature into a willing partner. Water, the indispensable essence of any agricultural endeavor, was a scarce and precious commodity. The Maya depended on natural limestone sinkholes, known as cenotes, which served as deep, subterranean reservoirs for captured rainwater. But this was insufficient to sustain their growing numbers. They engineered vast, sophisticated systems, digging immense reservoirs, constructing intricate canal networks, and even designing subterranean, stone-lined conduits to capture and preserve every single drop of moisture. During periods of severe drought, these feats of hydraulic engineering were the difference between life and death, allowing entire communities to persevere in regions that otherwise would have been impossible to cultivate. Their ingenuity extended far beyond water management. At the very core of their existence stood maize, not merely as sustenance, but as the sacred essence of creation itself. The Maya believed that the gods had sculpted the first true humans from maize dough, anointing this golden grain as the literal flesh and spirit of their people. Known to them as Ixim, maize was far more than a dietary staple. It was the axis mundi around which their cosmology revolved, woven into every ritual offering, every sacred chant, and every communal meal. Alongside maize, they cultivated a symphony of complementary crops, protein-rich beans that climbed the sturdy maize stalks, broad-leafed squash that blanketed the earth to suppress weeds and conserve precious moisture, fiery chili peppers, and the revered cacao bean, a bitter, frothy drink reserved for nobility and divine ceremonies, a liquid conduit to the gods. Maya agriculture was not a war against nature, but a profound symbiotic dance with it. In the dense lowland forests, they practiced the milpa system, carefully clearing small plots, burning the felled vegetation to enrich the soil with nutrient-rich ash, planting their sacred trio, maize, beans, and squash, for a few seasons, and then allowing the vibrant forest to reclaim the land, restoring its vitality. In the swampy wetlands, they displayed even greater innovation, constructing chinampas, artificial, raised garden beds built from layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and branches. These floating islands transformed stagnant marshes into fertile, productive gardens, a testament to their ability to adapt and thrive in even the most challenging environments. From the mist-shrouded highlands to the arid plains and the humid rainforests, the Maya mastered nearly every ecological niche, turning scarcity into abundance through patient observation and brilliant adaptation. Yet, for the Maya, farming was never a purely secular act of survival. It was a deeply spiritual covenant. When they sowed their seeds, they offered prayers to Chak, the mercurial rain god, whose favor was as essential as the sun. At harvest, they returned the first fruits to the earth and the altars, acknowledging the divine source of their bounty. Earth, water, seed, deity, and human were bound together in an unbroken, sacred cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This cycle, meticulously honored for centuries, generated the surplus that nourished millions and, crucially, freed the elite to pursue their grandest ambitions. The construction of awe-inspiring temples, the performance of elaborate, cosmically significant ceremonies, and the establishment of powerful, competing city-states whose influence radiated across the region. It was this sustainable, spiritually infused agricultural foundation that allowed legendary urban centers like Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza to rise like luminous beacons from the heart of the jungle. Every soaring temple facade, every expansive ceremonial plaza, every intricately carved monument was not merely a testament to political power or religious devotion. It was, in its deepest essence, a silent, stone hymn to the humble maize seed, the tiny golden kernel that through faith and ingenuity had built an entire world. When European explorers first hacked their way through the Central American jungles in the 19th century, they were met with a vision that defied belief. Colossal stone walls, draped in emerald moss, monumental staircases ascending into the canopy, and vast, silent plazas where the only sounds were the calls of birds and the whisper of the wind. They spoke of lost cities, but to the Maya, these were once the vibrant, pulsating hearts of their civilization, places where politics, religion, commerce, and culture converged in a dazzling, noisy symphony. Tikal, nestled in the Guatemalan lowlands, stood as one of the most magnificent of these urban jewels. Its temple pyramids soared above the endless green sea of the jungle like stone lighthouses, guiding not ships, but souls. Each pyramid was a dual symbol, a sacred portal to the heavens for worship, and a towering declaration of royal authority. The walls were alive with carved hieroglyphs, chronicling epic battles, strategic royal marriages, and solemn sacrificial rites that bound the populace to the divine order. To stand in Tikal's great plaza today is to almost hear the ghostly echoes of thousands of sandaled feet, to see the flicker of torchlight against ancient stone as night fell, a city teeming with life. Far to the west, in the Chiapas highlands of Mexico, Palenque offered a different kind of majesty. While Tikal reached for the sky, Palenque celebrated elegance and refinement. Its sprawling palace complex, complete with an astronomical observatory tower, labyrinthine corridors, grand meeting halls, and serene courtyards, was designed with an almost poetic sensitivity to its natural surroundings. It felt less like a fortress and more like a contemplative sanctuary, a place where rulers could commune with both nature and the stars. The discovery of the tomb of King Pakal the Great within the Temple of the Inscriptions became one of the 20th century's most significant archaeological revelations. The intricate, enigmatic carving on his sarcophagus lid, depicting the king descending into the underworld, ignited decades of scholarly debate and public fascination. A single stone panel encapsulating the Maya's profound, complex relationship with death and rebirth. Far to the east, nestled in the lush valleys of Honduras, Copan emerged as a grand open-air museum of Maya sculpture. Here the stone seemed to breathe. Altars and stelae were carved with such astonishing precision that the expressions on human faces, the intricate folds of ceremonial garments, and the delicate ornaments of jade jewelry remain vividly preserved centuries later. Copan was more than a political nexus. It was a cultural crucible where art and religion fused seamlessly into every carved surface. Each monument functioned as a silent, enduring chronicle, meticulously recording dynastic lineages, strategic alliances, epic wars, and the unwavering belief that human authority was inextricably bound to divine destiny. The very stones whispered stories of kings whose power was sanctified by the heavens. Then there is Chichen Itza, perched on the arid plains of the Yucatan Peninsula, perhaps the most iconic Maya city known to the modern world. Its central pyramid, El Castillo, also revered as the Temple of Kukulkan, was far more than an architectural wonder. It was a sophisticated, stone-built astronomical instrument of breathtaking precision. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the pyramid's northern staircase creates the illusion of a colossal serpent slithering down from the summit to the earth below, as if the feathered god himself were descending to commune with his people. This was not mere engineering. It was faith rendered in stone, a physical manifestation of the belief that the cosmos and humanity must move in perfect sacred harmony. Nature and religion, for the Maya, were never separate realms, but a single, unified tapestry. These magnificent cities did not exist as isolated islands. They were intricately connected by a vast, pulsating network of trade routes, diplomatic marriages, cultural exchange, and inevitably, warfare. Stone-paved causeways, known as Sakbiob, and navigable river systems linked Tikal with Copan, Palenque with Calakmul, and Chichen Itza with distant coastal villages. Along these arteries flowed not just material goods, cacao beans, precious salt, shimmering turquoise, and iridescent seashells, but also intangible treasures, ideas, sacred rituals, artistic styles, and philosophical traditions. Each city-state stood as a sovereign power, fiercely independent, yet together they formed the brilliant, interwoven chain that was the Maya civilization. Yet, for all their grandeur and complexity, these urban centers were not the primary homes of the majority of Maya people. Most lived in modest, scattered villages, tending their milpa fields and sustaining the agricultural foundation that made the cities possible. The great urban complexes served as ceremonial, political, and commercial stages, places where power was spectacularly displayed, where the gods were honored with elaborate, often bloody, rituals, and where the cosmic order was reaffirmed. In essence, the cities were the dazzling theaters of Maya life, while the villages were its quiet, enduring heartbeat. It was this delicate, symbiotic balance between the monumental and the mundane that allowed the Maya civilization to flourish for centuries. Beyond the awe-inspiring architecture and the intricate political tapestry, perhaps the Maya's most profound and enduring legacy is their writing system. Their hieroglyphic script, composed of hundreds of intricate signs that functioned as both logograms and syllabic elements, was capable of depicting concrete objects and expressing the most abstract philosophical concepts. This script adorned temple walls, towering stelae, and the few surviving books crafted from bark paper. Through it, the Maya recorded their dynastic histories, celestial observations, sacrificial rites, and even lyrical poetry. For them, writing was not simply a method of preserving memory. It was a sacred pathway to immortality. When a new king ascended the throne, a stone monument was invariably raised, not merely to proclaim his earthly power, but to etch his essence into the fabric of eternity. In the Maya worldview, an event did not truly exist, did not become real in the cosmic sense, until it was inscribed in stone. To carve a word or an image was to send a message across the chasm of generations, a declaration to both posterity and the gods that humanity had fulfilled its sacred duty. A stela, therefore, was far more than a historical record. It was a living bridge connecting the past, the present, and the eternal. Yet, for all its brilliance, Maya writing nearly vanished beneath the tides of time and conquest. When Spanish conquistadors and missionaries arrived in the 16th century, they viewed these intricate glyphs not as profound cultural achievements, but as dangerous heresies, diabolical marks that needed to be purged. In brutal, systematic campaigns of cultural annihilation, they consigned thousands of irreplaceable Maya codices, books meticulously crafted from bark paper to roaring bonfires. These were not mere acts of destruction. They were deliberate attempts to sever the Maya from their own history, cosmology, and identity. Only a handful of these fragile manuscripts miraculously survived: the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier codices. These precious fragments became the last flickering embers of a vast, extinguished library, our only direct window into the minds of the ancient scribes. For centuries, these glyphs remained silent, their meanings locked away. It was not until the mid-20th century that a monumental breakthrough occurred. Pioneering scholars like Yuri Konorozov, building on earlier work, finally cracked the code. They demonstrated that Maya writing was not purely symbolic or ideographic, as long believed, but a sophisticated logosyllabic system. Each glyph could represent a whole word, a logogram, or a syllable, a phonetic sign, allowing them to be combined to spell out complex words and sentences. This revelation was nothing short of revolutionary. A history that had lain mute for nearly 500 years suddenly found its voice again. As the inscriptions on the walls of Palenque, Copan, and countless other sites were painstakingly deciphered, a vivid, dynamic world emerged from the shadows. We learned of the decades-long reign of Pakal the Great, the intricate, bloody wars between the rival superpowers Tikal and Calakmul, and the Mayas' meticulous tracking of Venus, which they revered as a god of war, timing their military campaigns to its celestial movements. Their world was no longer a vague, mystical abstraction. It became populated with real individuals, complex political intrigues, and a deep, practical understanding of the cosmos. The dry stones of the ruins began to speak of love, betrayal, triumph, and tragedy. But Maya writing was far more than a mere record-keeping device. It was the very embodiment of their cosmology. They perceived time not as a linear progression, but as an endless, sacred cycle, perpetually repeating and renewing itself. Their calendars, most famously the long count, but also the 365-day Hab for the solar year, and the 260-day Tzolkin for sacred rituals, were not simple tools for marking days. They were intricate instruments designed to synchronize human life with the divine rhythms of the universe. Every coronation, every battle, every planting season, and every ritual sacrifice had to be meticulously aligned with the calendar, ensuring that human actions resonated in perfect harmony with the celestial order. Writing, therefore, was not just storytelling. It was an act of power, a form of prayer, and the very heartbeat of cosmic time itself. Imagine standing before a temple wall densely covered in glyphs. It was not merely a display of knowledge. The entire structure was transformed into a vast, open-air manuscript. Every carved stone was a letter, every architectural line a sentence, and the whole edifice a living, breathing text dedicated to the gods and eternity. To decipher such a wall today is not just an archaeological exercise. It is an act of profound resurrection, a calling back of a civilization's stolen soul. If writing was the Mayas' method of leaving an eternal voice for future generations, then their religion was the animating spirit that gave that voice its power and meaning. Nothing in the Maya world occurred outside the watchful eyes of the gods. Not the sowing of seeds, not the raising of a temple, not the declaration of war, not even the solemn vows of marriage. They envisioned their universe as a multi-layered reality, the celestial heavens above, the earthly realm of humans in the middle, and the dark, watery underworld below. These three realms were interconnected by a central, cosmic axis, most powerfully symbolized by the Keba tree. With its roots plunging deep into the underworld, its trunk standing firm in the human world, and its branches stretching high into the heavens, the Ceiba was the world tree, the sacred pillar that unified all existence. The Maya believed the universe had been created and destroyed multiple times, each age a distinct cycle. According to their sacred text, the Popol Vuh, the gods' first attempts at creation were failures. Humans fashioned from mud crumbled, and those carved from wood lacked souls and emotion. Only when the gods succeeded in crafting humanity from sacred maize dough, the very essence of life, did true, enduring humans come into being. This is why maize was not just sustenance, it was literal flesh and blood, proof that humans carried within them the divine spark of earth and sky. Their pantheon was vast and complex, populated by hundreds of deities, each governing a specific force of nature or aspect of life: the sun, the rain, maize, death, and the night sky. These gods were not static or predictable. They were fluid, capable of shifting forms, and embodied a dual nature, capable of both boundless generosity and terrifying wrath. The rain god Chak, for instance, was both a bestower of life-giving showers and a bringer of devastating floods. To worship such deities was to embrace this fundamental duality, to navigate the delicate equilibrium between divine blessing and cosmic retribution. Rituals, therefore, were not peripheral acts of devotion. They were the very engine that kept the universe turning. They were not confined to whispered prayers or offerings of incense. Often they demanded the most sacred substance of all: blood. Blood was considered the ultimate nourishment for the gods, the vital essence that sustained the celestial order. Kings and nobles, as the intermediaries between the human and divine realms, performed excruciating acts of self-sacrifice. They would pierce their own tongues, earlobes, or even genitals with obsidian lancets or stingray spines, allowing their blood to drip onto strips of bark paper. These blood-soaked papers were then burned, their smoke believed to carry the life force directly to the heavens, appeasing the gods and ensuring the continuation of the world. In moments of supreme crisis or celebration, the sacrifice escalated. War captives, often high-ranking nobles from rival city-states, were brought to the summit of the Great Pyramids. There, in full view of the assembled populace, their still-beating hearts were ritually extracted and offered to the sun god. To modern sensibilities, these acts are horrifying. To the Maya, they were the highest form of sacred duty, a necessary transaction to prevent the unraveling of creation itself. The temples themselves were the grand stages for these cosmic dramas. The towering step pyramids were not merely symbols of royal authority. They were deliberate recreations of the sacred mountains where the gods were believed to dwell. When a ritual unfolded at the summit, the entire community gathered in the plaza below, bearing witness to what they perceived as a direct communion between humanity and the divine. The air would be thick with the pounding of ceremonial drums, the haunting calls of conch shell trumpets echoing through the jungle canopy, the flicker of sacred fires against the night sky, and the solemn, rhythmic movements of dancers adorned in elaborate, feathered regalia. Together, these elements created an atmosphere of overwhelming, almost mystical power. It was a moment when the boundaries between the earthly and the celestial dissolved, when the community felt profoundly united, not only with each other, but with the very fabric of the cosmos. Religion and astronomy were inextricably intertwined. The Maya did not study the heavens merely to predict the seasons for planting. They used celestial movements, to dictate the timing of their most sacred rituals and political events. Venus, known as the Great Star, was particularly revered as a deity of war. Maya kings would meticulously plan their military campaigns to coincide with specific phases of Venus's cycle, believing that its position in the sky granted them divine favor and ensured victory. Similarly, the cycles of the sun and moon were intimately tied to human affairs governing fertility, the timing of life and death, and the rhythm of agriculture. The priests, therefore, held a dual role. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also the civilization's foremost astronomers and mathematicians. Their sacred duty was to ensure that every human action, from the coronation of a king to the sowing of seeds, was perfectly synchronized with the grand celestial clockwork. This absolute devotion to cosmic cycles elevated the calendar to a status far beyond a simple tool for marking days. It was the sacred blueprint for existence. The Maya employed several interlocking calendars. The 365-day Hab tracked the solar year and governed agricultural and civil life. The 260-day Tzolk'in was a sacred calendar used for divination and religious ceremonies, its days imbued with unique spiritual energies that determined the fortune or misfortune of any undertaking. Most famously, they used the long count calendar, a linear system that measured vast spans of time, stretching over thousands of years. To the Maya, each day was not a neutral unit, but possessed its own soul, a distinct force that could influence the destiny of events occurring upon it. Consequently, every significant act, weddings, declarations of war, the initiation of trade expeditions was planned with meticulous attention to the calendar, ensuring it was undertaken on an auspicious day. Remarkably, despite the immense complexity of their religious and calendrical systems, the Maya did not perceive them as burdensome obligations. Faith was as natural and essential as breathing. It permeated every facet of existence. Children were named according to the day of their birth, their lives forever linked to the spiritual significance of that date. The elderly passed away with the serene belief that they would be reborn into the next great cycle. Through every ritual, every festival, the community was constantly reminded that they were not isolated beings, but integral, pulsating parts of an eternal, universal rhythm. This profound integration of science and spirituality reached its zenith in their astronomical observations. The Maya did not gaze at the stars out of idle curiosity. They did so because they believed every celestial movement held direct, tangible power over human destiny. Their achievements in this field were staggering, rivaling and, in some cases, surpassing those of other ancient civilizations. Imagine standing in a Maya plaza on the precise day of the summer solstice. As the first rays of dawn break over the horizon, sunlight would pierce through carefully engineered apertures in temple walls, or align perfectly with the edge of a pyramid, striking a specific pre-calculated point on the ground or another structure. This was no coincidence. It was the culmination of generations of meticulous observation, complex mathematical calculation, and patient, disciplined record-keeping. The Maya sought nothing less than to map the very laws of the cosmos and embed them into the very stones of their cities. At the heart of this astronomical mastery lay an equally sophisticated mathematical system. The Maya employed a vigesimal or base 20 numeral system, a logical extension, perhaps, of counting on fingers and toes. Their notation was elegantly simple. relying on just three fundamental symbols: a dot representing the number 1, a horizontal bar standing for 5, and a stylized shell glyph signifying 0. This last symbol, the concept of 0, was one of their most revolutionary intellectual triumphs, a concept that eluded many contemporary civilizations. With this system, they could perform complex calculations involving vast spans of time and intricate celestial cycles with remarkable accuracy and flexibility. The evidence of their precision is preserved in the few surviving codices, particularly the Dresden Codex. This fragile manuscript reveals that the Maya calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for the planet to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, with astonishing accuracy, arriving at a figure of approximately 584 days, incredibly close to the modern value of 583, 92 days. They meticulously tracked Venus's phases, noting its disappearance into the glare of the sun and its subsequent reappearance as the morning or evening star. To the Maya, Venus was not merely a point of light. It was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, a potent god of war. The timing of military campaigns, therefore, was not left to chance or political expediency, but was dictated by the planet's celestial dance. A king would only march to war when Venus was in an auspicious position, believing divine favor was assured. Their knowledge extended far beyond Venus. They compiled detailed eclipse tables, predicting both solar and lunar eclipses with a degree of accuracy that continues to impress modern astronomers. These were not abstract predictions. They were events of immense spiritual and political significance. When the sun darkened, it was not a mere astronomical phenomenon, but a cosmic crisis, a moment when the celestial order was threatened. Priests, armed with their calculations, would stand before the populace, their knowledge serving not only as science, but as reassurance. Their ability to predict the eclipse and perform the necessary rituals to restore the sun was a powerful demonstration of their role as mediators between humanity and the volatile forces of the universe. Yet, for all their brilliance in the heavens, the Maya lived without many technologies we consider fundamental. They had no functional wheel for transportation, no domesticated beasts of burden to haul their massive stones, and no metal tools for construction or carving. Their magnificent temples, towering pyramids, and intricately inscribed stelae were all erected using stone tools, wooden levers, and the sheer, coordinated effort of human labor. This apparent paradox, how a civilization lacking such basic mechanical advantages could achieve such sophisticated scientific mastery, only deepens the sense of wonder. The answer may lie in their fundamental philosophy. For the Maya, knowledge and technological innovation were not pursued for material convenience or economic efficiency. Their ultimate goal was cosmic harmony. Aligning a temple perfectly with the solstice sunrise was infinitely more important than inventing a wheel to drag stones. Maintaining balance with the heavens was paramount. Earthly efficiency was secondary. This is what truly set their civilization apart. They did not chase convenience. They pursued a sacred, cosmic equilibrium. When you place your hand on a stone carved with Maya glyphs, you are not merely touching ancient rock. You are touching a record of a mind that was patient enough to observe the sky across dozens of generations, to capture the subtlest movements of distant stars, and to encode that knowledge into a system so sophisticated it gave rise to countless myths in later centuries. From this patient observation emerged their most famous creation, the calendar. It was not simply a tool for marking days, but a deeply philosophical construct. Time for the Maya was not a straight line hurtling into the future. It was a vast, sacred spiral, endlessly returning upon itself. Within this spiral, no one was ever truly gone. They were reborn into the next cycle. This cyclical view applied not only to individuals, but to their own history, prosperity, and collapse. Loss and renewal were all part of the eternal rhythm. And perhaps, when we search for the mystery of their so-called disappearance, this is the essential lesson they leave us. Their retreat from the great cities was not an ending, but merely a turning point in the great, unending cycle of time. Beyond the astonishing heights reached by their mathematics and astronomy, Maya society itself was an intricate, dynamic organism built upon a complex and often volatile political structure. Unlike the centralized empires of Rome or China, the Maya world was never unified under a single, all-powerful ruler. Instead, it was a vibrant, competitive mosaic of dozens of independent city-states, each governed by its own divine king, or Kuhul Ajau, the Holy Lord. These sovereigns were not merely political leaders. They were living conduits between the human realm and the divine, their very bloodline believed to be descended from the gods themselves. Their legitimacy rested not on military might alone, but on their sacred duty to maintain cosmic balance through elaborate rituals and, crucially, through the shedding of blood, their own and that of their enemies. These city-states existed in a perpetual state of flux, forming fragile alliances, engaging in brutal warfare, and betraying one another with the capriciousness of celestial bodies. Their relationships resembled constellations in the night sky, brilliant, interconnected, yet constantly shifting, with stars flaring into prominence, only to fade back into darkness. At the apex of each city-state stood the king, supported by a powerful noble class who served as generals, administrators, and high priests. The priests, in particular, wielded immense influence, for they alone held the keys to the heavens. They interpreted the movements of the stars, calculated auspicious dates for war and ceremony, and ensured that every human action resonated with the sacred rhythms of the universe. The army, therefore, was not merely a tool of defense. It was a sacred instrument for capturing prisoners, whose ultimate fate, ritual sacrifice, was considered essential for nourishing the gods and sustaining the world. Beneath this glittering, blood-stained elite lay the true foundation of Maya civilization: the farmers, artisans, and merchants. It was their labor, their sweat, and their unwavering toil that fed the cities, built the temples, and fueled the economy. War, for the Maya, was not primarily about territorial conquest or economic plunder. It was, above all, a sacred hunt for captives. To capture an enemy king and publicly sacrifice him on the summit of a pyramid was the ultimate triumph, not just a political humiliation for the defeated city, but a cosmic victory that reaffirmed the victor's divine mandate. This is why warfare was so endemic, so ritualized. It was not aimed at annihilation, but at perpetuating a cycle. Victory led to sacrifice. Sacrifice demanded more war, and more war weakened the very fabric of society. This vicious feedback loop, while initially fueling the competitive brilliance that raised Tikal and Calakmul to greatness, ultimately sowed the seeds of their collective undoing. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul the two undisputed superpowers of the classic Maya period, perfectly illustrates this dynamic. For centuries, they waged a series of devastating proxy wars, pulling smaller city-states into their orbit like planets caught in a gravitational tug-of-war. Victories were celebrated with grand monuments and public sacrifices, but the balance of power was always precarious. A single, decisive defeat could shatter a dynasty, sending shockwaves through the entire political landscape. The carved stelae that still stand in silent testimony across the ruins record these conflicts not as dry historical accounts, but as epic, divinely sanctioned dramas. They depict kings standing triumphantly over bound, humiliated captives, their expressions a blend of piety and ruthless power. These were not mere propaganda, they were declarations to the gods and to posterity that the king's authority was absolute, ordained by the heavens. Yet, beneath the surface of these grand declarations, a dangerous cycle was accelerating. The more victories a king achieved, the more captives he sacrificed, and the more sacrifices he performed, the greater the demand for new wars to supply the next ritual. This relentless escalation placed an unsustainable burden on the populace. Farmers were conscripted, fields were abandoned, and resources were funneled into endless military campaigns and ever grander ceremonial displays. In this fragmented world, where loyalty was to the city-state and not to a broader Maya identity, there was no central authority capable of uniting the people against a common, existential threat. When the rains failed and the crops withered, each city-state was left to fend for itself, locked in rivalry and suspicion, unable to pool resources or coordinate a response. The very decentralization that had once fostered incredible cultural and intellectual diversity became a fatal flaw when true catastrophe struck. The inscriptions that once celebrated their greatest triumphs now stand as silent monuments to a profound paradox. The very practices the Maya believed sustained the universe may have been the very forces that hastened its collapse. When we examine the decline of the Maya civilization, most modern scholars agree that the causes were not singular or sudden, but rather a complex web of deep internal crises that had been festering within their own society for generations. For centuries, the Maya population had grown steadily, buoyed by ingenious agricultural techniques and periods of relative political stability. Great cities like Tikal, Copan, and Palenque may have housed populations numbering in the tens, even hundreds of thousands. But this very success became their Achilles heel. To feed such vast numbers, the Maya were forced to push their environment to the absolute brink. Their milpa system, which relied on rotating fields and allowing the forest to regenerate, only functioned effectively when populations were smaller and land was abundant. As numbers swelled, farmers could no longer afford to let fields lie fallow. They were forced into continuous cultivation, stripping the soil of its vital nutrients until yields plummeted. In the highlands, carefully constructed terraces began to erode under the assault of heavy rains. In the lowlands, the intricate canal systems, once marvels of engineering, could no longer contain the floods or preserve water during droughts. The forests, which had served as the lungs of the land and a source of timber and game, were cleared at an alarming rate, leaving behind barren, vulnerable landscapes. Nature, once a partner in their success, began to turn against them, paleoclimatic studies now provide compelling evidence that during the 9th century, Central America was gripped by a series of prolonged, devastating droughts, some lasting for decades. When the seasonal rains failed to come, when the sacred cenotes and reservoirs ran dry, the entire agricultural foundation of Maya society crumbled. Maize, the sacred grain that was the literal flesh of their people, could no longer be grown in sufficient quantities. A civilization that had structured its entire existence around the rhythm of the rain now found itself staring into an abyss of hunger and despair. As famine took hold, the social contract began to unravel. Farmers, the backbone of society, could no longer feed their families, let alone support the temples and the nobility. Many simply abandoned their fields and villages, fleeing into the wilderness in search of survival. Others, driven to desperation, rose up against their rulers. Meanwhile, the elite and the priesthood, insulated in their stone palaces, continued to demand ever more elaborate offerings and blood sacrifices, believing that only through intensified ritual could they appease the gods and bring back the rain. The gap between the ruling class and the common people, once bridged by shared faith and the promise of cosmic order, widened into an impassable chasm. The final inscriptions from this era often speak not of triumph, but of increasingly desperate, almost frantic bloodletting. As if the harder times became, the more the Maya clung to the rituals they believed could save them. But no amount of sacrifice could summon the rain. And when the rituals failed, when the gods seemed to have abandoned them, the spiritual foundation of their society began to collapse. The people of Copan provide one of the starkest examples of this unraveling. At its zenith, Copan boasted a sophisticated, river-fed agricultural system, but rapid, unchecked population growth stripped the surrounding hillsides bare. Archaeologists have found that the fertile topsoil had been eroded down to a thin, almost negligible layer, leaving only raw bedrock beneath. With the land exhausted and the rains gone, the people had no choice but to abandon their magnificent city, leaving behind its towering, unreadable stelae as silent sentinels to a vanished world. The fall of the great Maya cities was not a sudden, apocalyptic event, but a slow, agonizing unraveling, a civilization collapsing under the weight of its own accumulated stresses. The clearest evidence of this decline can be seen in Tikal, once the radiant heart of the classic Maya world. Archaeological records indicate that around the year 869, the last monumental stelae were erected. After that date, silence descended. No new temples pierced the jungle canopy. No more inscriptions celebrated royal triumphs. Instead, the inexorable advance of the forest began to reclaim the stone plazas and staircases, as if nature itself were gently drawing a green veil over a civilization that had exhausted its vitality. Copan, famed for its breathtaking hieroglyphic stairway, the longest known Maya text carved in stone, met a similar fate. After its final dynasty faded, its people drifted away, leaving behind a city of silent, unreadable monuments. Palenque, with its exquisite poetic carvings, and the majestic tomb of Pakal, also slipped quietly into obscurity, its temples and palaces swallowed by a thick blanket of vegetation. This collapse did not occur simultaneously across the entire region. Some cities succumbed earlier, while others clung to life for another century or more. Yet the overall trajectory was unmistakable and irreversible. One by one, the great centers of power were abandoned, and the resonant drumbeats of sacred rituals faded into an echoing silence. The people, however, did not vanish overnight. They did not simply cease to exist. Instead, they dispersed, drifting away from the grand ceremonial urban stage and returning to a simpler, more sustainable life in scattered villages. They continued to farm small plots of land, removed from the elaborate, resource-intensive political and religious systems that had once defined their existence. One of the most poignant indicators of this societal collapse is the silence of the stelae. For centuries, every Maya king had commissioned these towering stone monuments, carving his victories, his lineage, and his sacred duties into eternity. But by the end of the 9th century, the inscriptions stopped. This was not because kings no longer ruled, but because the entire system had become too exhausted, too depleted, to sustain the immense labor and resources required to raise such monuments. History, once boldly carved in stone, now slipped quietly, irrevocably, into silence. Archaeological excavations of commoners' dwellings from this twilight period tell a sobering story. Artifacts recovered reveal poorer quality belongings, scarcer food remains, and makeshift, hastily constructed living spaces. Life for ordinary people had grown markedly harder, with the soil depleted, harvests failing, and the endless cycle of warfare draining their strength and resources. The promise of urban life had dimmed, the burden of tribute payments to the elite and the demands of increasingly desperate religious rituals became unbearable. Families packed what little they could carry and set out in search of survival, seeking refuge in remote valleys or along less contested riverbanks. And yet, this was not extinction. The Maya did not disappear. They simply stepped away from the grandeur of their monumental age. Their descendants continued, and continue to this day, to plant maize, to honor their gods in quiet, personal ways, and to speak their ancestral languages. What ended was not their existence, but their era of colossal stone pyramids, of intricately carved stelae proclaiming divine kingship, and of vast, cosmically aligned ceremonial centers. The pyramids ceased to rise. The stelae fell silent. The grand public rituals that once synchronized human life with the movements of Venus and the solstices faded away. By the 10th century, many of the great southern cities lay fully surrendered to the jungle. Stone causeways grew thick with moss. Temple walls crumbled into indistinguishable heaps of rubble. Birds nested where priests once chanted, and wild animals roamed freely through plazas that had once echoed with the footsteps of thousands. To nature, humanity's most dazzling achievements were merely a fleeting moment. The forest returned, lush and indifferent, as if the palaces and temples had never pierced its green canopy. As the cities of the southern lowlands fell into profound silence, many observers might have concluded that Maya civilization had reached its definitive end. But history, especially Maya history, is never so simple. In truth, the story did not end there. In the northern reaches of the Yucatan Peninsula, a remarkable resurgence began. A new chapter marked not by the replication of the past, but by adaptation, fusion, and resilience. At the heart of this revival stood Chichen Itza, a striking testament to the Mayas' enduring vitality in the face of catastrophe. Chichen Itza possessed a unique, almost providential advantage over its southern predecessors. Its location near a series of vast natural limestone sinkholes known as cenotes In a region where rainfall was notoriously unpredictable and prolonged droughts were a constant threat, these deep subterranean reservoirs provided a reliable, year-round source of fresh water. This sustained not only daily life, but also the intense religious devotion that remained central to Maya identity. For the Maya, the cenote was far more than a well. It was a sacred portal to the underworld, the dwelling place of the rain god Chak and other powerful deities. Ritual offerings, including precious jade, gold, and even human sacrifices, were cast into its dark, watery depths in the fervent belief that such gifts would appease the gods and bring back the life-giving rains. The treasures and skeletal remains recovered from these cenotes stand as haunting, tangible witnesses to the depth and desperation of those ancient rites. From the 10th to the 12th century, Chichen Itza flourished, rising to become the most powerful and influential city in the post-classic Maya world. Its greatness lay not only in its scale, but in its breathtaking synthesis of cultural styles. The Temple of the Warriors, with its forest of carved stone columns depicting ranks of stoic warriors, stood as a monument to martial might and political power. Yet, the city's most iconic structure, the Pyramid of El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, was a masterpiece of both architecture and astronomy. Its design was so precise that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a series of triangular shadows down the northern staircase, creating the illusion of a giant, feathered serpent slithering earthward. This was not mere construction. It was the physical manifestation of a worldview in which science, faith, mathematics, and myth were inseparable, woven together into a single sacred tapestry. Unlike many of the fractured southern cities, often torn apart by the ambitions of rival kings, Chichen Itza appears to have embraced a more collective, perhaps even council-based, form of governance. Some scholars propose that power was not concentrated in the hands of a single divine monarch, but shared among a group of elite lords or priestly families. This more distributed model of authority may have provided a crucial buffer against the kind of dynastic collapse that had doomed Tikal and Calakmul. It allowed the city to absorb political shocks and maintain stability over a longer period, even as the wider Maya world continued to reel from the southern collapse. Trade, too, was the lifeblood that fueled Chichen Itza's resurgence. Its strategic location near the coast transformed it into a vibrant, cosmopolitan hub, a crossroads where goods, ideas, and people from across Mesoamerica converged. Salt, harvested from the northern coastal flats, honey from the inland forests, brilliantly colored feathers from tropical birds, precious jade from distant quarries, and especially obsidian, the volcanic glass sharper than any steel, all flowed through its bustling marketplaces. This commercial network extended far beyond the Yucatan, linking Chichen Itza to cultures as distant as the highlands of central Mexico. Its influence radiated outward, turning it into the undisputed superpower of the post-classic Maya world. Yet, what makes Chichen Itza most remarkable is not its scale or its wealth, but its astonishing cultural synthesis. Its temples and sculptures reveal a profound and deliberate blending of styles, most notably the powerful influence of the Toltec civilization from central Mexico. The Temple of the Warriors, with its forest of carved columns depicting stoic, armed figures, and the iconic Chakmul statues, reclining figures holding offering bowls upon their chests, are direct echoes of imagery associated with the Toltec god king Quetzalcoatl, known to the Maya as Kukulkan. These parallels are not coincidental. They suggest that rather than retreating into isolation after the southern collapse, the Maya of Chichen Itza actively opened their doors, absorbing, adapting, and integrating foreign traditions into their own cultural fabric. This remarkable adaptability allowed Chichen Itza to thrive as a truly multicultural center, a place where diverse beliefs and artistic expressions converged and coalesced. And yet, beneath this dazzling brilliance, the familiar tensions of Maya civilization still simmered. Like all great Maya cities before it, Chichen Itza could not escape the gravitational pull of internal power struggles. By the 12th century, its dominance began to wane. Factional disputes among the ruling elite, combined with the relentless rise of ambitious rival city-states, gradually chipped away at its authority. Eventually, a new power emerged to claim the mantle of northern supremacy, Mayapan. Still, the ruins of Chichen Itza stand today as a monument to a golden age unlike any other. To stand before El Castillo at the moment of the equinox, to witness the play of light and shadow, conjure the image of the feathered serpent descending the steps, is to be transported. One can almost hear the thunderous drums, feel the energy of the dancers, and sense the profound unity between the community and the cosmos. It was a moment when time itself seemed to fold, when the heavens and the earth were one. Thus, the so-called disappearance of the Maya becomes far more complex than popular legend suggests. They did not vanish in the 9th century. They shifted, transformed, and re-emerged with renewed vigor in the north. But each of these rebirths proved to be shorter-lived than the last, each subsequent decline more profound, until finally, the civilization that had once illuminated the jungles with stone and fire faded into the long shadows of collective memory. All that Chichen Itza had proven, that the Maya could rise again from the ashes, also foreshadowed an inescapable cycle. When power becomes too concentrated, too rigid, it inevitably fractures from within. Behind the brilliance of Chichen Itza, the curtain of history rose on its successor, Mayapan. Deep in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayapan drew its people inward, constructing a city defined by its formidable stone walls. These walls encircled not just plazas and temples, but the very homes of the ruling elite, creating a compact, densely populated, urban core designed for control and security. Unlike the sprawling open cities of the classic age, Mayapan represented a conscious choice, a response to centuries of crisis. After the trauma of collapse, the Maya opted for contraction, pulling the reins of power tight and placing ultimate authority within a single, fortified center where it could be vigilantly guarded. Mayapan did not stand alone. For a time, the Yucatan was governed by a loose but powerful alliance known as the League of Mayapan, which included the great cities of Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan itself. This league was envisioned as a political pact, a commercial network, and above all, a promise of stability after generations of devastating upheaval. But every alliance is built on a fragile equilibrium. As the ruling lineages of Mayapan grew ever more powerful, they began to subtly and then overtly tilt the balance of power in their own favor, slowly suffocating their erstwhile partners. Walking among Mayapan's ruins today, one can still perceive the echo of this late Maya aesthetic. Small, almost miniature pyramids mimic the grandeur of El Castillo. Temples of sacrifice stand ready, and rows of Chacmul statues cradle their offering bowls. The Toltec motifs endured, the feathered serpent still coiled across the stones, but everything felt condensed, scaled down, squeezed within the tight confines of a walled city. It was the architecture of the post-classic era, pragmatic, militarized, less concerned with celestial grandeur and more focused on earthly control. Economically, Mayapan thrived by leveraging the trade networks already established by its predecessors. Salt continued to flow from the northern coasts, honey and cotton from fertile inland valleys, cacao from warmer southern regions, and obsidian and jade through ancient, well-trodden routes. Even exotic goods like bronze bells and axe heads, originating from lands far to the west, found their way into its bustling markets. The city's economic heartbeat was strong, fueled by tribute and taxes that streamed into its fortified core. Ceremonies, festivals, and armed guards upheld the new, tightly controlled order. Yet, this system was a double-edged sword. The more the elite demanded wealth to fund ever grander rituals and larger armies, the heavier the burden became on the outlying villages and farms. Each successive drought, each failed harvest, widened the cracks beneath the city's gleaming surface. Politics in Mayapan was tightly interwoven with bloodline and lineage. Powerful families monopolized key positions, sealing their dominance through strategic marriages and hereditary succession. Late inscriptions and oral histories passed down through generations speak of rulers who wielded both sacred ritual authority and raw, unyielding force to maintain their grip on power. They understood, perhaps better than any before them, that whoever controlled the calendar and the timing of the gods' festivals held the true reins of society. Yet this very obsession with ceremony and divine spectacle often led to dangerously short-sighted decisions. A system so rigid, so closed off from innovation or dissent, proved incapable of absorbing the shocks delivered by famine, epidemic, or climatic catastrophe. If Chichen Itza symbolized openness, cultural fusion, and adaptability, Mayapan embodied contraction, control, and an almost suffocating rigidity. Its formidable walls were not merely physical defenses. They were a declaration. From this point forward, the world would be divided, compartmentalized, and ruled with an iron fist. Yet, no structure, no matter how thick its walls or how vast its armies, can endure indefinitely if it loses the consent of the governed. Once greed and paranoia eclipsed wisdom and restraint, the pressure within Mayapan's walls became unbearable. Like a sealed vessel heated beyond its limits, it was destined to explode. By the mid-15th century, the fragile alliance that had held the Yucatan together finally shattered. Rival noble lineages, particularly those from the Puyuk Hills and the northwestern regions, rose in open rebellion against Mayapan's ruling elite. This was not a simple palace coup or a change of dynasty. It was a full-scale civil war that raised the very foundations of centralized power. The once mighty walled city was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Its columns toppled, its temples desecrated, its plazas stained with the blood of kin against kin. Yucatan fractured into a constellation of smaller, fiercely independent political units known as kuchkabals, each governed by a local chief or council. The dream of a unified northern Maya superpower vanished, replaced by a patchwork of competing territories bound together only by fleeting truces and mutual suspicion. The fall of Mayapan marked a definitive turning point. Daily life for ordinary people continued. Markets still bustled. Salt caravans still moved along coastal routes. Bees still produced honey in forest hives. But the overarching political order had collapsed into chaos. Without a central authority strong enough to mediate disputes or coordinate responses to crisis, communities were left to fend for themselves. The League of Mayapan, which had once promised stability and collective strength, faded into a distant memory, its legacy replaced by a fragile, uneasy peace, maintained only through constant, low-level conflict. Culture, however, proved far more resilient than political structures. Maya languages continued to be spoken in villages and homes. The sacred 260-day Tzolk'in calendar still guided the timing of births, marriages, and funerals. The ancient cosmology, with its layered universe and cyclical view of time, continued to frame the most significant moments of life. Yet, the grand vision of a radiant capital city, its temples piercing the jungle canopy to commune with the sun, had slipped irrevocably into the realm of memory. No longer did colossal pyramids rise to greet the dawn. Instead, smaller, humbler imitations of El Castillo dotted the landscape, poignant, scaled-down echoes of a fading dream. After Mayapan, true leadership devolved to local chieftains, to pragmatic, short-term calculations, and to modest fortifications defended by small bands of warriors. If Mayapan offers a lesson to history, it is the peril of concentrating power in the aftermath of crisis. Centralization can indeed provide temporary stability, but without mechanisms for equitable power sharing, social mobility, or peaceful conflict resolution, it becomes a pressure cooker. Mayapan clamped the lid down tight, allowed resentment and inequality to simmer, and provided no safety valve. When the explosion finally came, it was catastrophic and irreversible. Its collapse was not merely the fall of a capital city, it was the violent swing of a pendulum, driving the Yucatan from forced unity back into deep, entrenched fragmentation, a political rhythm that would define how the Maya confronted the unimaginable challenges that lay just beyond the horizon. For on that horizon, strange sails began to appear, gliding across the shallow turquoise waters of the peninsula, as civil war still smoldered in the ashes of Mayapan, voices speaking alien tongues and carrying the thunder of gunpowder were about to make landfall. The fragmentation that followed Mayapan's collapse did not merely weaken the Maya's ability to heal and rebuild. It created fatal fissures that outsiders would soon exploit. History rarely delivers its most devastating blows with a single strike. More often, it waits until you are at your weakest, then sends in the enemy. For the Maya, after centuries of enduring cycles of rise, collapse, and rebirth, the next encounter would be unlike any before, a collision with a world they could not have imagined, one that would alter their destiny forever. The first fleeting contact came in 1502, when Christopher Columbus, on his final, weary voyage, encountered a large, ocean-going Maya trading canoe off the coast of Honduras. Laden with cotton textiles, salt, honey, brilliantly colored feathers, and precious cacao beans, the vessel was a testament to the sophistication and reach of Maya commerce. The Europeans were stunned, not only by the quality and quantity of goods, but by the evident organization and skill of a people entirely unknown to them. Yet, this moment was little more than a brief, curious footnote. Within a few short decades, expeditions arrived with far more deliberate and far more destructive intentions. In 1511, a Spanish shipwreck cast its first survivors onto Maya shores. Among them was Gonzalo Guerrero, a soldier who, after being captured, chose not to resist but to integrate. He married a Maya noblewoman, fathered the first mestizo children of the region, and eventually rose to become a respected military commander, fighting fiercely alongside his adopted people against his former countrymen. His extraordinary story stands as one of the most poignant symbols of that tumultuous era. To the Spanish, he was a traitor, even a cautionary tale. To the Maya, he was proof that even the most foreign of warriors could become a loyal ally. Guerrero's path, however, was the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of Spaniards who followed came armed with a dual, divinely sanctioned mission: to expand the dominion of the Crown of Castile and to spread the Catholic faith to lands they deemed steeped in idolatry. To their eyes, the towering temples, the intricately carved stone idols, and the ritual sacrifices performed atop the pyramids were not expressions of a profound cosmology, but abominations that demanded immediate, violent eradication. They carried the cross in one hand and the sword, soon to be joined by the terrifying crack of the musket, in the other. When Hernán Cortés marched into the heart of the Aztec Empire in 1519, the Maya were not his primary objective. Yet, the Yucatan Peninsula quickly became strategically vital. On his way inland, Cortés dispatched detachments to secure coastal towns. They met with fierce, courageous resistance, but the technological and tactical imbalance was overwhelming. Gunpowder, armored cavalry, and disciplined European formations toppled one Cuchcabal after another. Yet, the Maya were not the Aztecs or the Incas. They possessed no single, centralized empire, no glittering capital whose fall would mean total surrender. Instead, they were a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states and chiefdoms, a reality that made their conquest slower, messier, and far more protracted. It would take nearly 2 centuries of relentless campaigning, negotiation, betrayal, and brutal suppression before the Spanish could claim to have fully subdued the Maya. Some towns negotiated treaties, hoping to retain a measure of local autonomy by pledging loyalty and tribute to the Spanish crown. Others chose open rebellion, launching fierce, often desperate attacks against colonial garrisons. Still others, tragically, saw an opportunity to settle ancient scores, allying themselves with the invaders to bring down their traditional rival. This profound lack of unity, a direct consequence of centuries of political fragmentation, proved to be their most crippling vulnerability. It prevented the formation of any coordinated, large-scale resistance capable of repelling the technologically superior and relentlessly organized Spanish forces. What might have been a unified front became a series of isolated, doomed struggles. The conquest was not merely a military campaign. It was a systematic assault on the very soul of Maya civilization. As Spanish missionaries pushed deeper into the peninsula, they embarked on a campaign of cultural annihilation. Stone idols, revered for centuries as manifestations of divine power, were smashed to rubble. Sacred temples, meticulously aligned with the heavens, were desecrated, their altars defiled, and in many cases, Catholic churches were erected directly atop their foundations, a brutal, physical symbol of spiritual conquest. But the most devastating blow came in 1562, in the town of Mani, Yucatan. Bishop Diego de Landa, convinced he was performing a holy duty, ordered a massive auto da fe, thousands of irreplaceable Maya codices, bark paper books containing centuries of accumulated knowledge on astronomy, intricate calendrical calculations, sophisticated medicinal practices, and profound mythological narratives, were consigned to roaring bonfires. Alongside them, countless sacred images and ritual objects were destroyed. In a single, catastrophic act, the intellectual and spiritual heart of the post-classic Maya world was ripped out. Of all those magnificent libraries, only 4 codices, the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier, are known to have survived, fragile, scorched remnants of a vast, extinguished world. Yet, even as their temples burned and their books turned to ash, the Maya faced an enemy far more insidious and deadly than Spanish steel or gunpowder: disease. European pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, for which the indigenous population possessed no natural immunity, swept through the densely populated villages and towns like an invisible, unstoppable tide. Entire communities were wiped out within a single season. Fields lay fallow, homes stood empty, and the intricate social fabric unraveled. For the survivors, this invisible plague was more terrifying than any conquistador. It seemed as if the gods themselves had abandoned them, turning their backs on a people who had faithfully maintained the cosmic order for millennia. The psychological and spiritual devastation was absolute. And yet, even in the face of this apocalyptic onslaught, the spirit of resistance never fully died. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Maya groups rose in rebellion, retreating into the deepest, most impenetrable reaches of the jungle to regroup and launch guerrilla attacks against Spanish outposts. They kept the flame of freedom alive, clinging to the hope that one day their world could be restored. In remote villages, far from the watchful eyes of colonial authorities, the Maya quietly preserved their identity. They continued to speak their native languages within the walls of their homes. They secretly maintained their ancient rituals, sometimes cleverly disguising them beneath the outward forms of Catholic masses. A whispered prayer to Chuck for rain might follow a public Hail Mary. This was not surrender. It was a profound act of cultural defiance, a quiet, enduring resistance waged not with swords, but with memory and continuity. Their world had been irrevocably shattered, but they, as a people, had not vanished. They adapted, they endured, and they waited. Waves of uprisings continued to sweep across the Yucatan for centuries. Each time taxes became unbearable, each time a harvest failed, each time a priest attempted to erase another fragment of their ancestral beliefs, Maya villages would rise in collective fury. Most of these rebellions were brutally crushed by Spanish forces, but their very existence proved one undeniable truth. The Maya spirit was unbreakable. The collective memory of pain, of loss, of sacred sites desecrated and knowledge burned was not buried. It was passed down from generation to generation, a subterranean river of grief and resolve, waiting for the moment it would surge to the surface. If the 16th century was the violent storm of conquest, then the 17th and 18th centuries were the long, drenching rains of colonial oppression, eroding, wearing down, but never fully washing away the bedrock of Maya identity. They learned to navigate a world of dualities, outwardly submitting to Spanish authority, while inwardly preserving their own. They learned to blend and to hide, to speak Spanish to the authorities while whispering their mother tongue to their children, It was a tense, precarious balance, a life lived in the shadows, but it was a life that ensured their survival through the darkest centuries. As history moved toward the 19th century, however, a new storm was gathering on the horizon, one that would not come from across the ocean, but from within the crumbling edifice of the Spanish Empire itself. The 19th century dawned with political earthquakes, shaking the entire landscape of Latin America. The once mighty Spanish Empire, stretched thin and weakened by internal strife and external pressures, began to fracture. Independence movements, fueled by Enlightenment ideals of liberty and self-determination, erupted from Mexico to Argentina. In 1821, Mexico formally declared its independence, and the Yucatan Peninsula, the ancestral homeland of the Maya, was absorbed into this new nation. For the Maya, however, this seismic political shift brought not liberation, but a cruel irony. The yoke of Spanish rule was simply replaced by a new, often more rapacious, form of oppression. The large haciendas, sprawling agricultural estates owned by Spanish-descended elites or wealthy mestizos, continued to expand, swallowing up the communal lands that Maya villages had farmed for generations. The Maya were forced into a system of debt peonage, bound to the land by crushing taxes and impossible debts, effectively becoming serfs on their own ancestral soil. Vast tracts of forest and fertile fields, once held in common, were transformed into monoculture plantations, most notably for henequen, the agave plant, whose tough fibers fueled the global demand for rope. The land, once revered as a living mother, was reduced to a mere commodity, and its people, the Maya, were reduced to expendable labor. The caste war of Yucatan, which erupted in 1847, was not merely another localized rebellion. It was a full-scale, existential war between the Maya and the landowning elite, who were now backed by the fledgling Mexican state. For generations, Maya families had watched helplessly as their communal lands were seized, their forests cleared, and their traditional way of life dismantled to make way for vast henequen plantations. Farmers were beaten, taxed into destitution, and trapped in cycles of debt that amounted to little more than serfdom. When all avenues of peaceful redress were exhausted, they chose the only path left, armed resistance. What followed was not a skirmish, but a decades-long conflagration that would come to define the 19th century in the Yucatan. Initially, the Maya fighters, hardened by life in the unforgiving jungle and driven by a desperate, righteous fury, achieved astonishing victories. They defeated Mexican federal troops in open battle, captured key towns, and pushed their advance to the very outskirts of Mérida, the regional capital. For a fleeting, electrifying moment, it seemed as if the entire peninsula might be reclaimed, as if the ghost of a unified Maya nation might rise once more from the ashes of history. In Maya collective memory, these years are remembered not as a lost cause, but as a powerful resurgence, a defiant echo of their ancient glory. One of the most extraordinary and spiritually potent symbols of this struggle was the emergence of the talking cross in the remote forest settlement of Chan Santa Cruz. According to widespread belief among the rebels, a wooden cross hidden deep in the jungle began to speak, offering divine guidance, strategic advice, and unwavering encouragement to the Maya fighters. While outwardly adopting the symbol of the Catholic cross, perhaps as a shield against accusations of paganism, its message and the fervent devotion it inspired were deeply rooted in indigenous cosmology. Chan Santa Cruz rapidly transformed from a hidden refuge into the de facto capital of the Maya resistance, complete with its own government, military structure, and spiritual center. For decades, it stood as a sovereign Maya state within the borders of Mexico, a living testament to their unbroken will. Yet, as with all prolonged conflicts, the tide eventually turned. Internal divisions began to fracture the rebel movement. Some factions, weary of the endless bloodshed and economic blockade, sought negotiated settlements. Others, led by charismatic warlords, remained committed to total victory. Meanwhile, the Mexican government, now better equipped and receiving foreign arms and financial support, launched a relentless, brutal counteroffensive. The war devolved into a grinding war of attrition, dragging on for over 50 years. The lush jungles and fertile fields of the Yucatan became a charnel house. By the early 20th century, the organized resistance had been largely crushed, though isolated Maya communities in the most inaccessible regions maintained their autonomy well into the 1930s. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Maya perished, not only in battle, but from starvation, disease, and the systematic destruction of their villages. The land itself bore the scars of war. Yet the caste war accomplished something profound. It shattered, once and for all, the myth that the Maya were a vanished people. They were not relics of a bygone era, but a living, breathing community, capable of mounting a sustained, sophisticated, and spiritually charged resistance against a modern nation-state. Their struggle was a declaration to the world. We are still here. We have not forgotten. We will not be erased. The bitter irony of this period was that while the Mexican elite viewed the Maya as backward obstacles to progress, it was the Maya's profound resilience, their deep connection to the land, and their unyielding cultural identity that proved to be the most enduring forces. They resisted not only with the machete and the musket, but with memory, with language, and with an unbreakable cultural will. As the 20th century dawned, the Maya entered a new, complex chapter. The winds of industrialization, globalization, and the modern nation-state swept across the Yucatan Peninsula and the Guatemalan highlands. Yet, for the majority of Maya communities, daily life remained anchored in the rhythms of the cornfield, the terrace farm, and the village nestled beneath the forest canopy. They did not step into the modern era as a blank slate. They carried with them the immense, often painful, weight of centuries. In Mexico, following the revolution of 1910-1920, the new government sought to forge a unified national identity, one heavily centered on the concept of mestizaje, the blending of Spanish and indigenous heritages. While this ideology celebrated the Maya as glorious, distant ancestors whose pyramids adorned the national myth, it simultaneously marginalized their living descendants. In the real world, Maya people were often dismissed as poor, uneducated, and unworthy of political participation. Their languages were ridiculed and suppressed in schools. Their traditional rituals were banned or driven underground. Their lands continued to shrink under the relentless pressure of modern economic development projects. In Guatemala, the situation was even more dire. The 20th century unfolded under a succession of military dictatorships and periods of intense political instability. The Maya, who constituted nearly half the population, yet occupied the very bottom rung of the social and economic ladder, became the primary targets of state-sponsored violence. The Guatemalan Civil War, 1960-1996, inflicted a wound of unparalleled depth on the Maya people. In a series of genocidal counterinsurgency campaigns, the Guatemalan army systematically targeted Maya villages, accusing entire communities of harboring guerrillas. Hundreds of thousands of Maya men, women, and children were massacred. Entire villages were wiped off the map, their inhabitants herded into churches and burned alive, or marched into the mountains and executed. Behind the cold statistics lay a living nightmare. People condemned not for their actions, but simply for their identity, for being indigenous. And yet, even in the face of this unimaginable darkness, Maya identity did not perish. In the remotest villages, women continued to weave intricate textiles on backstrap looms, their brightly embroidered huipilis, blouses, serving as vibrant, wearable declarations of cultural survival. The patterns were not merely decorative, they encoded ancient cosmological symbols, clan histories, and spiritual beliefs, a silent, colorful language of resistance. Maya languages, though banned from schools and public life, survived in the intimate spaces of the home, in lullabies sung to infants, in stories whispered by grandparents, in the barter and banter of the marketplace. The spoken word, passed down through generations, became the most potent weapon against cultural annihilation. The 20th century closed not with silence, but with a powerful, resonant awakening. After centuries of being spoken for, studied as relics, and marketed as exotic curiosities, the Maya began to speak for themselves, with clarity, with authority, and with unyielding cultural pride. This was not merely a cultural revival. It was a profound reclamation of identity, a defiant assertion that their civilization had never ceased to exist, only transformed. One of the most potent symbols of this resurgence has been the revitalization of language. Across the highlands of Guatemala, the villages of Chiapas, the plains of the Yucatan, and the remote corners of Belize and Honduras, Maya communities have launched ambitious, grassroots initiatives to bring their ancestral tongues back from the brink. Bilingual education programs, often spearheaded by local teachers and elders, now flourish in hundreds of schools. Children learn to read and write not only in Spanish or English, but in Quiche, Yucatec, Quechua, Mam, and dozens of other Maya languages. For these children, language is not just vocabulary and grammar. It is a worldview. When they learn to call the rain chak or the maize ixim, they are not learning words. They are inheriting a cosmology, a way of understanding their place in the universe that has been passed down for millennia. Each classroom becomes a sanctuary of cultural continuity, a quiet act of resistance against centuries of enforced linguistic erasure. This linguistic renaissance has been mirrored by an extraordinary flourishing of contemporary Maya literature. Poets, novelists, and essayists are now publishing powerful works in their native languages, giving voice to the joys, sorrows, resilience, and dreams of their people. Humberto Acabal, a Quiche poet, stands as a towering figure in this movement. His verses, spare and hauntingly beautiful, draw directly from the rhythms of the land and the ancient oral traditions of his ancestors. He writes of mountains that breathe, rivers that sing, and cornfields that whisper secrets to the wind. His work, translated into dozens of languages, has carried the Maya soul onto the global literary stage, proving that their creative spirit is not confined to the past, but vibrantly alive in the present. In the visual arts, the message is equally clear and equally powerful. The intricate symbolic patterns traditionally woven into women's huipilis blouses that serve as wearable histories are no longer confined to village markets. Maya textile artists now exhibit their work in galleries from New York to Paris, transforming ancient motifs into bold contemporary statements. Painters and sculptors are also reclaiming their heritage, blending pre-Columbian iconography with modern techniques to create works that speak to both their ancestral past and their complex present. Their art is not nostalgic, it is declarative. It says, "We are here, we remember, we create." Perhaps the most profound revival, however, is taking place in the realm of spirituality. After centuries of suppression and forced conversion, ancient Maya rituals are being practiced openly and proudly once more. In the mist-shrouded highlands of Guatemala, Ajcuije spiritual guides and daykeepers lead ceremonies atop sacred mountains, offering prayers of cornmeal, copal incense, and candles to the spirits of the earth, sky, and ancestors. These rituals, often performed in the native tongue, are not acts of pagan defiance, but of cultural reintegration. For many Maya, Catholicism and their ancestral beliefs are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary threads in a rich, complex spiritual tapestry. A family might attend Mass on Sunday and then journey to a sacred cave on Monday to make offerings to the Earth Lord. This syncretism is not confusion. It is balance, a testament to the Maya's extraordinary capacity to adapt and endure without surrendering their core identity. This cultural reawakening is intrinsically linked to a powerful political and social resurgence. The Maya are no longer content to be passive subjects of history or marginalized citizens in their own homelands. In Guatemala, Maya organizations have become formidable forces for social change, demanding recognition, land rights, and political representation. Indigenous leaders now sit in Congress, their voices echoing in halls of power that once sought to silence them. Student movements, led by young Maya intellectuals, are challenging discriminatory educational systems and rewriting national curricula to include their own histories and perspectives. In Mexico, the Zapatista uprising of 1994 remains a defining moment. While not exclusively Maya, the movement drew its strength and moral authority from the indigenous communities of Chiapas, many of whom are Maya. Their cry of "Ya basta," enough, was a rejection not only of economic exploitation, but of cultural annihilation. The Zapatistas experiment in autonomous governance with its emphasis on direct democracy, gender equality, and ecological stewardship, stands as a radical, living alternative to the dominant global order, a model deeply rooted in indigenous values of community and reciprocity. Globally, the Maya have become powerful voices in the fight for environmental justice. As the guardians of some of the world's most biodiverse and threatened ecosystems, the rainforests of Petén, the wetlands of the Yucatan, they stand on the front lines against deforestation, mining, and climate change. Their struggle is not framed in the abstract language of carbon emissions, but in the deeply personal, spiritual terms of protecting their Mother Earth. They remind the world that sustainability is not a new concept, but an ancient practice, that true progress cannot be measured in GDP, but in the health of the land and the dignity of its people. And so, As we reach the end of this long, intricate narrative, we return to the question that began it all. What happened to the Maya? The answer, we now see, is breathtakingly simple, yet infinitely complex. They never disappeared. They endured. They adapted. They resisted. They remembered. The silence of the stele was not an ending, but a pause, a breath held in the long cyclical rhythm of their existence. The pyramids may have been swallowed by the jungle, but the spirit that built them never died. It lived on in the quiet villages, in the whispered prayers, in the resilient hearts of a people who refused to be erased. Today, the Maya stand not as a cautionary tale of collapse, but as a beacon of resilience. They are a living testament to the power of cultural memory, to the unbreakable bond between a people and their land, and to the enduring human spirit that, against all odds, continues to rise, to create, and to speak its truth to the world. Their story is not over. It is being written anew every day in the classrooms, the cornfields, the ceremonial fires, and the defiant, beautiful voices of a civilization that refused to vanish and never will.